We'll go ahead and get started. So in this presentation, I will be discussing the process of assessing trees for risk. And we're going to look at some of the common defects as well as some of the considerations involved in tree risk management. Uh, the goal of this presentation really is to just a brief survey on how we inspect trees using the ISA tree risk assessment qualification standards and protocols, and what to look for in that process and exactly where to look. It's tree risk assessment, and the inspection process is a uh, specialized systematic process that reads the body language of the tree and to help us determine what that overall risk rating is, and most importantly is make the appropriate mitigation or apply the appropriate mitigation to reduce risk to others and property and disruption of activities. Also reducing liability. We'll talk a little bit about the legality involved there. And of course, reduce health issues, which improves the sustainability of those plants. So oftentimes I get this question, again, as an urban forester that I practice in private consulting, and also then I teach on campus in urban forestry and that question, is my tree safe, is literally $1 million question. You are culpable for that answer should that tree fail. Even something as simple as this little branch hanging over this walking trail can present a level of risk that's perhaps unacceptable to that park or to that municipality. Same with this dead top in this tree. And you see this bench and this walking trail. And one of the things that we'll talk about is, in order to have risk, you have to have a target. And what this community park is saying is, hey, we want you sitting here, and hey, we want you walking here. So it's incumbent upon the tree manager or the park manager to assess trees on a regular basis to determine if there's any type of mitigation or any type of work that needs to be done to make that tree less risky. Lightning strikes are one of those that are very perplexing. Like leaning trees, we'll talk a little bit about leaning trees. This was quite a contentious tree in Indianapolis. This is a tree leaning from the edge of Broad Ripple Park. We know why that tree is growing like that is because it's at the wood's edge, and it's basically responding to phototropism. So we'll talk about leaning trees and if they are truly dangerous and how to determine that. But anyway, think about it. If you play golf or if you've been around a golf course, where do golfers go when it storms and rains? They typically go under trees. So we want to make sure that they are safe in that process. These are some over a golf green. You can see this certainly does present a certain level of risk to the golfers. Again, more leaning trees. So is this tree safe? Absolutely, because it's already failed it on the ground. But you can't see it underneath here, but there's another picnic table, and you can see there's one here at the edge. So what would happen if that tree failed and there had been people, again, congregating in that area? So whenever you have designated areas under trees, you've got to be sure that they're inspected for safety. This was a huge cottonwood tree in Indianapolis that fell very close to a daycare playground area that still gives me shivers to think about what would have happened had there been some children playing in the area during that prior to that storm coming through. So more campground pictures. You can see there's, again, campgrounds are just as important to maintain safety because there's a lot of people that go through those areas and in those designated trails, and they require an elevated risk protocol in that process. So basically, as I've mentioned, the reason why we inspect trees is to reduce risk of injury or damage to property or disruption of activity as far as people and For example, if a tree falls across the road, obviously that's going to disrupt activity. But the idea between risk inspections is to anticipate problems because oftentimes we can prevent injury and damage before the failure occurs if we know exactly what to look for and how to implement the proper mitigation. We all have a duty of care. In Indiana, there is court precedents, and it's important to understand a little bit of legalese when it comes to tree risk assessment. But everybody has a legal obligation that requires them to employ reasonable actions to keep their property safe. And as far as trees goes, that means if, for example, if you or your parents or anybody in your family owns a home, owns a piece of property and has trees on it, they have a duty to inspect and maintain those trees to a certain level of safety or a certain level of risk. And that all leads to a standard of care, which is basically the degree of care which a reasonable person would exercise when performing a duty of care. Also, what about the tree next door? There's a tree that seems to be, this was actually one here in West Lafayette, dead tree hung up in a healthy tree. And the neighbor was fearful that the next wind would blow it over. But oftentimes there's not a whole lot you can do unless you can prove that it does provide some unacceptable level of risk. So what can you do? So before we get into looking at defects and what to do about them, first of all, we want to make sure that if we're inspecting a tree or looking at tree issues, we want to make sure that we understand who actually owns that tree. And do you really have any rights to that tree? Ownership is the first thing to establish in determining whether or not you can actually do anything with it. And also, do you have the rights or permission to encroach on other people's property? So, I talked a little bit about target zone already. In order to have risk, you do have to have some type of target. What we typically look at is the height of the tree. 1 to 1.5 times the height of the tree. So if we were to lay that tree down and draw a circle all the way around, anything within that circle can be considered a potential target. So we look at all those things like cars, pedestrians, play sets, houses, pedestrians, anything that could be, again, injured, damaged, or disrupted by tree failure. So exactly what do I look for on the tree? It's just looking at some of the things, basically starting with the root zone, looking at trees to determine, or excuse me, tree roots to see if there's any um, fungal fruiting bodies or root damage, perhaps from mowers or construction equipment. Examine the trunk to see if there's any type of defects or cavities or decay that's going on there. I'll also check the root system to look for girdling roots that could be compromising the vascular system of the tree and causing some issues in the upper part of the canopy. I look at branch structure to see what type of branch habit it has, if there's codominant stems. I'll look for defects such as perhaps cracks or other types of weaknesses. You can see in the sugar maple, there's a crack there because that's a codominant stem, which is a very weak attachment between two branches and have very high likelihood of failure. Again, reading the body language of the tree. I just look for things that could cause the tree to fail. You know, these old wounds, it looks like where an old lead has come out of there. It's trying to heal and recover from that. But again, there's problems occurring inside. Overextended branches can create a problem, especially if there's excessive weight or dynamic forces such as wind loading causes a tree to break. Another weak branch attachment, you can actually see where that's cracked as well. So again, basically what I'm doing is just looking at the body language of the tree, looking at it in three basic sections. I look at the roots, I look at the trunk, and I look at the crown in isolation, and then together to determine what really is issues that are increasing the likelihood of failure. Now, just a few basic things that we'll look at real quickly. Again, trees don't fall at random. It's usually some catastrophic event. It's usually a combination of things. And it starts with a defect. And when you have a tree with a defect, there's usually some external stimulation or other type of issue that causes that tree to fail. And in Indiana, in most places, it's usually wind, ice, snow, some dynamic loading which occurs. This is my quintessential tree for poor health and structure. What we look for as far as overall health and structure, again, poor branching, which I talked about in that short little vignette of a video. Look for pest damage, poor growing conditions. As you see, or might not be able to see, there's obviously there was a new parking lot put in there, which compromised the root system. Looking at for improper pruning, dieback and dead wood. Again, one of the things we also look for, are there any targets? This is actually a park in Noblesville, Forest Park, and determine if there are any targets which are threatened. And obviously we've got picnic tables, a grill, we got a parking lot. There's obviously lots of targets there, and it's incumbent upon the park manager to make sure that they maintain that tree to an acceptable level of risk. When we look at limbs and branches, we look very closely. You can see there's a dead hanging limb here, which could be easily dislodged onto the street or the lawn below. You can see where this big, large dead limb is hanging right over this very active driveway that leads to the back part of the park there. So again, it's one of those things that should be inspected on a regular basis. And oftentimes park managers and tree managers, after a storm, like first thing that should be done is go out and just take a quick level 1 inspection where you just do the drive-by and look for the Mr. Obvious things that need to be perhaps flagged for a closer look. Now, leaning trees, again, it's not very scientific, but they fall into two categories. They're either natural or unnatural. And usually it's a matter of looking to see if they've corrected their lean with a sweep of some kind. Unnatural leans, you'll typically see a dislodged root system, usually on the windward side of the tree. So if the wind's coming from this side, you won't see anything, maybe a depression on the leeward side, but on the windward side, you'd see some lifted roots or heaving root plate. Now on a corrected lean, you'll see adapted to that growth habit. Similar to this sycamore tree, this tree has been there since the early 1800s, but you can see it's natural in the fact that it's corrected and compensated for the weight and balance. So not all leaners are dangerous. Again, check the soil, check the root plate. Also check the holding capacity of the tree from a trunk perspective on the tension side, and then also this side would be the compression side of the tree to make sure that the root, or excuse me, the trunk fibers are all in good condition and don't have any decays or other defects. Cracks and splits are very common in trees, typically due to lightning or perhaps torsional cracks or shear plane cracks, depending upon the type of wind loading that they experience. But it's just basically a separation of wood fibers. It's just a localized failure caused by, again, either excessive compression, tension, or torsion, and usually an indicator of overloading, again, from wind. The one on the right is actually a crack from lightning damage on this oak tree. It's one of the parks in Indiana. But you can see it's recovering, forming that all-important wound wood that closes up that defect. Now you can see on this one, it's not closing up very well at all. So obviously that tree exhibits an elevated risk level as opposed to this oak, which has basically recovered completely from that. You can see a crack here on or a seam that's healing somewhat, but it's fluxing, which shows that there's some bacterial activity going on inside there, presenting an unacceptable level of risk to the park. Another one here, you can see, we see these all the time where you have these cracks and decay in the ram's horns or the enrolling of the wood fibers here. Again, you got to look to see the amount of damage, and the likelihood of failure is quite relative to health and condition of the tree and also species. All trees have some decay in it or some defect. It's decay is the most common cause of failure in trees. It usually starts with a wound on the tree and just something as simple as hitting it with the mower, or damaging it with a string trimmer, or bumping it with a car. Anything that causes a separation of that trunk, that protective armor, which is the bark on the tree, then it becomes bad news later on. So something as simple as planting a 3-inch tree and, oh, darn it, I hit that trunk with the shovel or whatever tools you were using, and you think, not a big deal. But it can be later on. It starts with something that simple. So you see the different types of decay that you see. This is actually from damage from construction. This is a canker. What once was a construction damage, and then also you oftentimes see this frass and kind of woody debris, almost like sawdust. Whenever you see that, that's typically the results of ants, carpenter ants. You can see them. I was pounding on a tree here trying to see if there was any inside. You can see those little guys just kind of moving around. Those are great little forensic buddies that tell you that, yep, there's decay in there. They won't attack live living tissue, but they will dislodge that which is decayed, and they just through colonization. So anytime you see those, that means you've got something going on in the tree. So we won't spend a lot of time on the different types of decay organisms, such as you see on the left there, Ganoderma, Latoporus there, or chicken of the woods, the more Ganoderma, Serena, bicolor is another one. These are all different types, have different modes of action. But these create a weakened condition in the tree and are indicative of internal decay, which requires a greater level of inspection there to make sure that the tree is not experiencing any type of elevated risk. Hollow trees, they're everywhere. A hollow tree is certainly not more dangerous than any other, because think of where the living part of the tree actually is. So when it comes down to it, hollow trees can be very stable trees. They provide homes for animals. You can see the little squirrel looking at me there. But a lot of times it just depends on the extent and location, whether it falls, this decay or hollowness, the hollow area falls in the middle part of the tree or on the perimeter of the tree, which creates two different types of levels of risk and likelihoods of failure there. I'll probe for decay to look to, I use a surveyor's pin there to kind of get an idea of structural integrity of the internal wood fiber. You can see it's really soft in there. Now, as I move up, farther up on the trunk, you can see it's pretty solid. I'm not penetrating that at all, but there's a very weak area there that certainly provides some level of concern and potential for failure there, all the way down towards the bottom of the trunk. And also sound for decay. We use a sounding hammer. This is one of my friends, Aaron, in Lafayette here.
Go back down to that root.
You can see even the root is hollow there. So you can get an idea of extent and location of decay just by using a sounding hammer and just kind of determining where those hollow places are. You can hear
down to that root.
You can tell the difference in the responses or the pings on how the integrity of the wood fiber sounds there. So All right, we've talked about the crown, we've talked about the trunk. Now we'll finish up with the roots real quickly here. Again, we're going to look for fruiting bodies, any type of weird fungal stuff like armillaria here, which shows a compromised root system. Basically, it's decaying, and so the fungal organisms are feeding on that. We have some Ganoderma here working on the tree, and also oftentimes it can be obscured by ground cover, such as this horribly invasive, awful winter creeper. Again, you got to really look closely and maybe move some things around in order to get a good inspection of that tree. Root disturbance, one of the biggest enemies of trees and biggest pests of trees are people. Just by cutting roots, disturbing roots, compacting roots, raising or lowering the grade as little as 2 or 3 inches can actually cause decline and deterioration and perhaps death of the tree. But root cutting, like in this roadway project, certainly creates not just a health issue, but a stability problem as well. About 5 years ago, they put in a new roundabout. This is what it looked like. Obviously, parking and all kinds of compaction and digging around this beautiful oak tree. This is what it looked like 2 years later. This was what it looked like in the third year. So it's root disturbances are very serious issues that create havoc for trees. Again, protecting those prior to construction is how we reduce that potential. All right, so we've identified some tree issues or unacceptable risk. So what do we do? There are some strategic ways of reducing risk to an acceptable level. If we can move or remove the target, that's certainly one of the best things we can do. It may be temporary. Prune the tree if there's dead branches or stems that need removed in order just to make be as simple as that to make it safe. Installing structural support such as cabling or bracing may help mitigate that risk, especially like on co-dominant stems and branches. Modifying the site to improve conditions. We may have girdling roots, and if we excavate the soil and do some root surgery, we might improve that situation. And last and certainly least is removing the tree. Sometimes there's just not really anything else we can do other than just take the tree down. And it's the ultimate security and ultimate risk management. But again, we want to go through these logical solutions to protect the target and preserve the tree if possible.